Well, Australia's Prime Minister-designate says he will stage no-snap elections after he was chosen as a new leader of the country's ruling party. Malcolm Turnbull also pledged to bring economic vision to the country, where public and business confidence is declining amid a slowing economy. Turnbull took control of the Liberal Party after defeating Prime Minister Tony Abbott in the party's leadership vote. The Prime Minister-designate had called for the election amid declining public support for Abbott's two-year-old Conservative coalition government. Australia has also been hit with political instability triggered by party coups over the past years. The country's changed 5 prime ministers in 8 years. To get more analysis on this story, we're joined by political commentator Mimi Al-Laham from Australia itself. Well, it was a surprise ouster attempt, don't you think, Mimi? After all, Tony Abbott and his challenger, Turnbull, have very much in common. They're both Rhodes scholars, they're lawyers and journalists. So what do you think gave Turnbull, the Goldman Sachs man, as he's been dubbed, the upper hand?
Well, you know, the reason why it was such a surprise is that Tony Abbott actually had a seat in Canning, and the seat was held by an individual named Don Ronald, who suddenly died. And when the seat is lost to the Liberals, there has to be a re-election on that seat. And even though the voters there are supporters of the Liberal Party, the vote actually turned against Tony Abbott, and that resulted in the leadership of Tony Abbott being seen as weak and being seen by the Liberal Party as potentially losing popularity for the Liberals. And in this situation, they can, within the party itself, vote to remove the Prime Minister and change him. And for whatever the reason Malcolm Turnbull won, has nothing to do with the Australian public or what the Australian public perceive of him, but what the Liberal Party perceive of him, which is that he could possibly be a better leader to keep the party in power.
Well, Turnbull becomes the 5th Prime Minister for Australia in 8 years. What does that tell us about Australian politics?
Well, it tells us 2 things. You know, first of all, Australian politics is not a presidential system, it's a party system. So people don't vote for a personality or a prime minister, they vote for the party. And that party can then switch the prime minister no matter when. Like if it becomes unpopular or there's a problem, they can switch. It's basically a changing of the chairs. So that's one of the reasons. The other reason is because the Australian economy and Australian people are so unhappy with the way things are run that no matter who gets elected, their popularity quickly crumbles. Perhaps not even because of their policy, or perhaps including because of their policies, but also because of the climate that Australia is facing right now. It's such a dire economic situation, probably thanks to multiple failed policies in the past. And the situation for its US allies and its allies in the region is also dire.
Well, the pro-US and pro-war policies of the Abbott administration were among the most unpopular characteristics of his government. Do you think Australians will have a meaningful change in such policies in the future?
Unfortunately not, because it's still a Liberal Party government, and both the main parties in Australia, it's a 2-party system. The Liberals and the Labour Party pass power to each other. Both of them are completely controlled by the US government, and in fact, whenever a leader is elected, they have to also pay a visit to Israel and pay their respects to the Israeli government. So unfortunately, there's not going to be any change in that. It's just basically a change in seats. You know, they just change seats, shuffled around in the hope to trick people into believing that things are going to change. But it's really out of the government's hands to stop the economic collapse. And it's also out of the government's hands whether or not it chooses to follow the US into multiple wars, because unfortunately the US has bases in the Australian government and has basically taken over this country.
Sad truth for modern democracy. Mimi Al-Laham, political commentator, joining us from Australia. Well, that's all the time we have.